Title: The Perfect Betrayal. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. There are moments in life where everything shatters in an instant, but somehow, the world keeps spinning like nothing's happened. I could see him sitting there, at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone as if everything was still normal. But it wasn't. It hadn't been for months. I found out in the most ordinary way. An email of all things. Not a lipstick stain on his collar, not a late-night phone call or suspicious perfume on his jacket. No, it was an email meant for her, but it came to me instead. And in that single moment, every piece of my life that I thought I understood fell apart. Still, here we were, pretending. I could see him out of the corner of my eye, oblivious, scrolling, while I stood over the stove like the dutiful wife I had always been. It's funny, really, how quickly life goes back to normal after you discover your husband of 12 years has been cheating on you. You'd think it would break you right away, that everything would fall apart in an instant. But no, life doesn't work that way. It just resumes. The kids still needed breakfast in the morning. The bills still had to be paid. There were still PTA meetings, birthday parties, and weekend trips to the park. Life demanded that I keep playing the role. So, I did. He didn't notice the change. Or maybe he just didn't care. I wasn't sure which was worse. "Hey, babe, any plans for tonight?" His voice broke through my thoughts, casual, as if he hadn't just torn my heart in 2 months ago, as if we were still the couple we used to be. He didn't even look up from his phone when he asked, didn't see the way my hand tightened around the spatula or how I swallowed hard before answering. "I thought I'd make your favorite tonight," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it would crack my face in half. "Steak and potatoes." His face lit up like a child's, like nothing was wrong. How could someone who'd lied for so long still enjoy something so simple? How could he sit there, in the home we'd built together, and pretend? "Sounds great. You're the best." The words hit me like a slap, even though they weren't meant to. I used to love hearing that from him. I used to believe it. Now, it was just a reminder of how easily he could lie. And so, just like that, everything seemed normal. It would have been easy to believe it was. But I knew better now. I knew the truth that lingered under every moment, every look, every kiss that no longer felt the same. But I had to play along. For now, narration, I knew I had to be patient. I had to let him believe everything was back to normal for now. We were sitting together at the dinner table later that night, the kids at their grandparents' for the weekend. The sound of his fork scraping against the plate was the only thing breaking the silence between us. I hadn't said much all evening. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was just relieved that I wasn't asking any hard questions. There were plenty of questions I could have asked, but I didn't. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting my steak into small, even pieces like a woman who hadn't spent the last 3 hours replaying every moment of our marriage, trying to figure out how it had all fallen apart. He'd always been good at keeping secrets. That much was clear. The perfect husband, the perfect father, the guy everyone trusted. I used to trust him too. Used to. After dinner, we sat on the couch, him watching TV while I pretended to read a book. I was supposed to be with him, supposed to be watching the movie he'd picked out. It was a comedy, something light to end the night with. But the laughter felt like it was happening in a different world, one I couldn't reach anymore. Every few minutes, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye, studying him. The lines on his face were deeper than they used to be, and the stubble on his chin a little grayer than when we first met. I used to love those little changes, the signs of time passing between us. Now they just felt like reminders of everything I'd lost. When he caught me looking, he smiled. A smile that used to make me feel safe, warm. But now, it felt like a mask. I wondered how many times he'd worn that same smile for her. How many times had he told her he loved her with the same voice he used to tell me? Narration. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's slow. It creeps in, a whisper at first, until it's the only thing you hear. And then, when you finally realize the truth, it's too late. It's already torn you apart. Later that night, after he'd fallen asleep, I lay in bed next to him, staring up at the ceiling. His breathing was deep, steady, peaceful. I used to find comfort in that sound, in the way he'd pull me close during the night, his arm draped across me like a shield. But not anymore. Now, every breath he took felt like a reminder of the lie we were living. I thought about waking him up, about telling him I knew everything, that I'd read the emails, seen the hotel receipts, figured out the late nights weren't really work meetings after all. I thought about asking him how long it had been going on, about how many times he kissed her goodnight before coming home to me. But I didn't, because that wasn't part of the plan. Narration. The moment you confront someone like him, the moment you show your hand, you lose. He would have turned it around on me, made me feel like I was the one who had done something wrong. And maybe, deep down, part of me would have believed him. No, I wasn't going to give him that power. I wasn't going to let him control the narrative, not anymore. I'd spent too many years trusting him, believing in him, thinking he'd never be capable of this kind of betrayal. But now I knew better. Now I knew that trust was just a weapon he'd used to keep me in the dark. So, I waited. The next morning, I made breakfast like I always did. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast. The routine felt almost comforting, in a way. Like if I just kept doing what I'd always done, I could pretend for a little while longer that things were still normal, that the life we'd built together hadn't crumbled beneath my feet. He came downstairs with a smile, kissed me on the cheek like he did every morning. "Smells great," he said, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting at the table. I smiled back, just like I always did. And for a moment, it almost felt real. Almost. But then he asked me something that made my heart stop. "Are you okay?" he said, looking at me over the rim of his coffee cup. I froze, spatula in hand, the eggs sizzling in the pan. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, his brow furrowing in concern. "You've seemed, I don't know, distant lately. Is everything okay?" Narration. For a split second, I thought maybe he'd figured it out. Maybe he knew I was onto him. But then I saw it in his eyes, that flicker of doubt. He was worried, but not about me. He was worried about his secret, about whether or not I'd uncovered it. I forced a laugh, shaking my head as I turned back to the stove. "I'm fine," I said, the lie rolling off my tongue more easily than I thought it would. "Just tired. You know how it is with work and the kids. Everything's fine." He didn't press it, just nodded, as if my answer was good enough for him. As if he wasn't the reason I couldn't sleep at night anymore. And just like that, we were back to our routine. That night, I stayed up late, sitting at the dining room table with the papers I'd started gathering. The emails, the receipts, the credit card statements. Proof. It had been weeks of quietly collecting evidence, of documenting every lie, every betrayal, every late-night phone call and unexplained absence. I didn't know why I was doing it, really. Maybe I needed to see it all laid out in front of me, to make it real. I stared at the pile of papers, feeling the weight of them settle into my chest. This was my life now, a life built on lies. But not for much longer. Narration. I wasn't just planning to leave. I was going to take everything. The house, the money, his pride. I'd spent too many years giving him everything I had. Now, it was time to take something back. As I climbed into bed that night, I glanced over at him, sleeping soundly, his face peaceful in the dim light of the moon. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Regret, maybe, or sadness. I wasn't sure, but it passed as quickly as it had come, because I knew what I had to do. I had to wait. I had to be patient. Let him believe that everything was fine. Let him believe that I was still the same woman I'd always been. The woman who trusted him, who loved him, who would never suspect a thing. And when the moment was right, I would take it all. Narration. I knew I had to be patient. I had to let him believe everything was back to normal for now. Chapter 2. Planting Doubts. 6 weeks. It had been 6 long weeks since that afternoon when I opened his email by mistake and my entire world crumbled. 6 weeks of wearing a mask, pretending that everything was just the way it used to be, when in reality, every second I spent with him made my stomach churn. He had no idea that I knew. He thought he was clever, but I had caught him. And I wasn't going to just leave him. No, I needed more than that. I needed to watch him suffer the way I had, to see his world fall apart like mine had. Quietly, slowly. The first few days after finding out, I toyed with the idea of confronting him. I imagined throwing the evidence in his face, screaming at him, letting all the pain I felt pour out. But then what? He'd get angry, or maybe he'd beg for forgiveness, and I'd be left with nothing but his empty promises. No, that wasn't enough. I couldn't just let him off with a confrontation. He deserved more than that. He deserved to lose everything. The plan didn't come to me all at once. It started small, a seed of an idea that slowly grew into something more dangerous. It began with a visit to a lawyer, a subtle first step during one of his many business trips. He thought I was at home, clueless, while he was off with her. Little did he know, I was meeting with a family lawyer, asking questions about what I was entitled to in case of a divorce. The lawyer, a woman named Sarah, had seen cases like mine before. She didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer up much. I just needed to know where I stood, how much I could take from him when the time came. She looked over our finances, nodded approvingly. "You're in a good position," she said. "You'd walk away with the house, most of the savings, and likely a good chunk of his salary and spousal support." Her words had a strange effect on me. Part of me felt a surge of satisfaction, but there was something else too, something colder, more calculating. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to take everything. Narration. I wasn't just planning to leave. I was going to take everything. The house, the money, his pride. After that meeting, the plan began to take shape. Slowly, I started siphoning money out of our joint account and into a separate one. Nothing big enough for him to notice, just a few hundred here and there. A transfer to an account in my name only. It was a slow process, but I had time. I couldn't rush this. It had to be perfect. At night, I'd lie awake next to him, listening to his steady breathing, wondering how long it would take for him to realize something was different. Did he notice that I didn't reach for him in the dark like I used to? That I turned away when he tried to pull me close? Did he wonder why I stopped making him breakfast in the mornings before he left for work? Or why I was suddenly more quiet at dinner, my smile never quite reaching my eyes? But he didn't say a word. There was a kind of sick satisfaction in watching him remain oblivious, so wrapped up in his lies that he didn't even see what was happening right under his nose. He was too busy with his late-night calls to her, thinking I was none the wiser. Some days, I'd sit beside him while he slept, staring at the outline of his face in the moonlight. I used to love him, truly, deeply love him. But now, all I felt was disgust. Disgust for him, for what he'd done to us, for how easily he could betray me and our children. He didn't deserve to walk away from this unscathed. He didn't deserve anything. The first time I withdrew money from our joint savings, I was nervous. My hands trembled slightly as I entered my account information online, transferring $1,000 into the account I'd opened in secret. The screen blinked for a moment, then confirmed the transaction. It was done. I sat back, staring at the screen, waiting for the guilt to hit me. It didn't. Instead, I felt a sense of control, a feeling I hadn't had since I found out about the affair. I was taking back what was mine, what should have been mine all along. After that, it became easier. Every few days, I'd transfer more, sometimes $500, sometimes $1,200. Always small enough amounts that wouldn't raise any alarms. He never checked the accounts, anyway. That was my job. I handled the bills, the savings, the budgeting. He was too busy with his work to bother himself with those details. And now, that would be his downfall. But it wasn't just about the money. No, I needed more than that. I needed him to doubt everything. I needed to plant seeds of doubt in his mind, to make him question his reality the way I had, to make him wonder if he was losing control. It started small. I began leaving my phone face down on the table when we were together, something I'd never done before. I could feel his eyes on it, wondering if I was hiding something. Sometimes, I'd take a phone call in the other room, lowering my voice just enough that he couldn't make out what I was saying. When he asked who I was talking to, I'd smile and say it was just a friend from work. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the slight flicker of uncertainty. He didn't know whether to believe me, but he didn't press. I started going out more, too. Nothing extravagant, just dinner with friends or a late-night movie, things I used to do all the time. But now, I made sure to get home later than usual, just late enough for him to notice. I'd make excuses, traffic, a long line at the store, and watch as he nodded, pretending not to care. But I knew better. I could see the doubt creeping in. One evening, after a particularly late dinner, I came home to find him sitting on the couch, his arms crossed, a slight frown on his face. "You're home late," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "There was traffic," I replied smoothly, hanging my coat by the door. "What? Did you think I was out having an affair?" The joke landed hard, and I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes before he quickly looked away. He laughed it off, but I knew I'd hit a nerve. Good. Narration. I had to be careful. I couldn't rush it. This had to be perfect. The next few weeks passed in a blur of careful manipulation. Every little detail had to be just right. I couldn't afford any mistakes. The money was still trickling into my private account, slowly but surely. I started looking into places to move, places where I could take the kids and start over once it was all done. I'd visit apartments during the day while he was at work, making sure everything was in place for when I finally made my move. But I couldn't leave yet. Not until I had everything lined up. Not until I had enough to walk away without looking back. I had to bide my time, keep planting those seeds of doubt, until he was so wrapped up in his own confusion that he wouldn't see it coming when I finally pulled the rug out from under him. Then came the night that everything shifted. We were sitting at the dinner table, the kids in their rooms, when he finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "You've been distant," he said, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Is something going on?" I looked up at him, forcing my face into a mask of confusion. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, frowning. "You've just been different lately. You're going out more, you're quieter. It just feels like something's off." Narration. I knew this moment would come. I had been preparing for it. But still, hearing the doubt in his voice, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes, it was like music to my ears. I put down my fork and sighed, as if his question had caught me off guard. "I'm just tired," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Work has been crazy, and with the kids, it's just been a lot." I didn't realize I'd been acting differently. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe I'm just imagining things." I smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "You're overthinking it. Everything's fine." He smiled back, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. He wasn't sure if he believed me, but he didn't want to push it any further. Not yet. That was the beauty of it. He had no idea what was coming, no idea that I was already steps ahead of him, quietly dismantling the life we'd built together piece by piece. He thought he had control, but he didn't. I was the one holding all the cards now. Narration. I wasn't ready to end it yet. There was still more to take, more to destroy. And when the time came, I'd make sure he never saw it coming. Every night, I played my part. The loving wife, the supportive partner. Every smile, every kiss, every kind word was part of the plan. Each moment a carefully crafted piece of the puzzle that would ultimately leave him shattered. He didn't deserve the truth. Not yet. He needed to believe everything was normal for just a little longer. And when the time was right, when I had everything in place, I'd tear his world apart, just like he'd torn mine. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Facade. The first sign that my act was slipping came late one evening. I had been out, meeting with the lawyer again, finalizing some of the finer details. When I returned home, it was already past 10. I hadn't called him that night, something I usually made sure to do. It was a routine I had stuck to for years, a sign of trust between us. Even after finding out about his affair, I continued the nightly call just to maintain the illusion. But that evening, I didn't. I was too wrapped up in what I was planning, the lawyer's advice still echoing in my mind, and by the time I got home, I realized I hadn't bothered to check in. He noticed. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, when he walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the doorframe, watching me. His silence was unnerving, and I knew he was about to ask something. "You didn't call last night," he finally said, his voice casual, but his eyes gave him away. "Everything okay?" I paused for a beat, careful not to react too quickly. He was studying me, looking for something, a crack in the mask I had been wearing. I had to be careful. He couldn't know what I was up to. Not yet. Just tired, I said, brushing it off with a smile. I lost track of time. Long day. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me. Then, he nodded slowly, but I could see it. The flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his brow furrowed just slightly as if he was trying to piece something together. Narration. He wasn't used to me slipping up. I always had a routine, always checked in. And in that moment, I saw it in his eyes. He was starting to question me. I turned back to the sink, focusing on rinsing out my glass, and when I looked up again, he was gone. It was the first time in weeks I had let something slip, and I could feel the tension rising in me. For the first time, it felt like maybe I wasn't as in control as I had thought. It was a small thing, just a missed phone call, but to him, it meant something was off. It was easy enough to explain away, and for the most part, he believed me. But the cracks in the facade were starting to show. He didn't say anything else that night, but I could feel the shift between us. Small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He was watching me more closely now, trying to figure out what was wrong, if anything at all. The next few days were harder. I had to be even more careful, more meticulous. Every word, every movement, had to be calculated. If he caught on too soon, the entire plan would fall apart. There were times I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I knew everything, to throw all the lies back in his face and watch him crumble. I had imagined it so many times, that moment of confrontation. His face when he realized I wasn't the oblivious wife anymore. But I couldn't do that yet. Not when I was so close to everything I had been working towards. So, I swallowed the urge. I waited. The second time he questioned me, it was more direct. We were having dinner, just the two of us. The kids were at a friend's house for the evening, and the quiet in the house felt suffocating. He hadn't said much that night, just pushing his food around on the plate. I could feel the tension building, like a rope tightening between us. Finally, he put his fork down and looked at me. "You've been distant," he said, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "Is something going on?" I looked up at him, my heart skipping a beat. This was it. He was starting to piece things together. The missed calls, the quiet moments, the nights I didn't reach for him in bed. He wasn't stupid. He could sense that something was wrong, but he didn't know what. Narration. I had to be careful. I had to let him think he still had the upper hand. Let him believe that whatever he was feeling was just in his head, that he was overthinking it. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a small sigh as if I was exhausted. "I'm just tired," I said, echoing the same excuse I had used before. "Work has been crazy, and with the kids, I didn't realize I was being distant." He studied me for a moment, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe me, but the doubt was there. It was small, but growing, and that's what I needed. I needed him to doubt himself, to question whether what he was seeing was real. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," he said finally, picking his fork back up. I smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You're overthinking it," I said softly, squeezing his hand gently. "Everything's fine." He smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not fully. He wasn't sure, but he didn't want to push it. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, I watched him closely. He was starting to act differently now, more cautious, more curious. I could feel his eyes on me when I wasn't looking, like he was trying to catch me in some kind of lie. But I was always one step ahead. When I went out, I made sure to come back earlier than expected, giving him no reason to question where I'd been. I'd leave my phone on the counter, unlocked, just to give him the illusion of trust. And yet, I could see the doubt lingering in his mind, the flicker of uncertainty every time I did something just a little out of character. One night, I accidentally left my phone in the car when I went inside after a late grocery run. It wasn't much, just 20 minutes of me being unreachable, but when I came back in, he was sitting on the couch, his face tight with something close to frustration. "You didn't have your phone on you," he said, his voice calm but strained. "I tried to call." "Oh," I said, my voice light, almost airy. "I must have left it in the car by mistake. Sorry about that." I went into the kitchen to put the groceries away, my back turned to him. I didn't need to see his face to know what he was thinking. His doubt was growing, and that was exactly what I wanted. He was starting to question everything, to wonder if I was hiding something. Narration. It was working. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and now all I had to do was wait for them to grow. It was becoming harder to keep up the act, but I knew I had to hold on a little longer. He still thought he had the upper hand, still believed he was the one in control. And that's what I needed him to believe. If I tipped my hand too soon, he would shut down. Or worse, try to get ahead of me. I kept the facade up, smiling when I had to, laughing at his jokes, pretending everything was normal. But inside, the tension was building. The more I watched him, the more I could see that he was starting to unravel. And I loved it. I loved watching the cracks form, the doubt seep in, knowing that soon enough, it would all come crashing down around him. Chapter 4. The Setup, Vacation Bliss. The opportunity to strike came 2 months later. Our friends, the ones we'd vacationed with every summer, invited us to their lake house for a long weekend. It was the perfect setup, a few days away, just us and our closest friends, like old times. He loved those trips, boating, grilling, laughing around the fire pit with a few too many drinks every night. It was always his favorite part of summer, a chance to unwind and forget about the stresses of work. And for me, it was the final piece of the puzzle. I had been waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to put the final steps of my plan into motion. This trip would be the distraction I needed, the thing that would convince him that everything was fine. We packed our bags and headed to the lake house on a Friday afternoon. I had made sure to play my role perfectly, smiling, laughing, even buying a new swimsuit that I knew would catch his eye. I played the part of the loving wife, letting him think that things were better between us, that maybe the distance he had sensed before was just a passing phase. When we arrived, our friends were already there, greeting us with warm hugs and cold drinks. It felt like old times, like nothing had changed. But in the back of my mind, I knew this was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Narration. He had no idea what was coming. To him, it was just another day in paradise. But for me, it was the end of the line. That night, we sat around the fire pit, the glow of the flames casting a warm light over our group. He was sitting next to me, his arm draped casually over my shoulders, a content smile on his face. I could feel the tension in my chest, knowing what was coming, knowing that soon enough, everything would change. He looked over at me, his eyes soft with affection, and I smiled back, playing my part. He had no idea that this would be the last time he would ever feel truly in control. Chapter 5. The Bombshell. The final night of the trip arrived faster than I expected. It had been an almost surreal few days. I played my part perfectly, smiling, laughing, acting like the doting wife, just as I had for months. We'd grilled by the lake, gone boating, and watched sunsets while sipping wine with our friends. He seemed completely at ease, finally convinced that everything was back to normal between us. It was the exact moment I had been waiting for, and tonight, I was going to tear it all down. We were all sitting around the fire pit, the sky dark, a canopy of stars above us. The flames flickered and cracked, casting warm shadows on everyone's faces. There was laughter, the clink of glasses as we toasted to old times. I held my wine in my hand, waiting for the right moment, my heart racing just beneath my calm exterior. I stole a glance at him. He was sitting beside me, one arm casually draped over the back of my chair, his eyes half-lidded from too many drinks, his face lit by the glow of the fire. He looked content, at peace, like he had everything he could ever want. The irony of it twisted in my gut. I waited for a lull in the conversation. People were laughing, sharing stories from years ago, but I barely heard any of it. My focus was solely on him, on the way his guard was completely down, how he smiled without a care in the world. He thought he had one. He thought we were good again, that he had successfully convinced me to forget everything. But that was the beauty of it. He had no idea. When the laughter finally faded and the fire crackled in the quiet that followed, I took my chance. My hand tightened around my glass for a moment, steadying myself. Then, I turned to him, my voice soft but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think it's time we tell everyone," I said, my smile sweet, practiced, perfectly placed. He blinked, confused. His brow furrowed as he looked at me, caught off guard. "Tell them what?" he asked, his voice light but tinged with uncertainty. I turned my body slightly, facing him fully now, and let the words fall from my lips like stones. "That we're getting divorced." For a moment, there was silence. Absolute, crushing silence. The fire crackled, and the wind rustled through the trees. But no one spoke. Every head around the fire pit turned toward us, eyes wide, frozen in shock. But it was his face I was focused on. His reaction. The way the color drained from his skin, his lips parting slightly, as if he couldn't comprehend the words I had just spoken. He looked like a child lost in the woods, completely bewildered, panicked. What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice shaky, eyes darting from me to the rest of our friends, as if hoping someone would laugh and tell him it was all a joke. But I wasn't laughing. I was calm, methodical, prepared. "I've already filed the papers," I said, reaching into my bag. I pulled out the divorce papers I had been carrying with me for days now, waiting for this exact moment. I placed them on the table in front of him, right next to his drink, the crackling fire casting an ominous glow over the white sheets. "The house, the accounts, it's all mine now," I continued, my voice steady, strong. I had rehearsed these words in my head 1,000 times, but nothing compared to the satisfaction of finally saying them out loud. He stared at the papers like they were poison, his hands trembling as he slowly picked them up. I watched him as the reality began to sink in, as the full weight of what was happening crushed him. His entire world was collapsing right in front of him, and there was nothing he could do about it. Narration. I wanted to do it in front of everyone he cared about. I wanted him to feel the betrayal as deeply as I did. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked up at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. You can't be serious," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. But I was serious, deadly serious. For months, I had been the one who was shattered, the one left to pick up the pieces of the life we had built together. And now, it was his turn. I watched as he flipped through the papers, his hands shaking, the panic setting in deeper with every page. The fire flickered in his eyes, but there was no warmth in them anymore, just fear. I let him sit there for a moment, let him process what was happening. I wanted him to feel it, to feel the weight of his actions crashing down on him. I wanted him to experience the same gut-wrenching betrayal that I had felt when I found out about her. But I wasn't done. Not yet. There was still one more piece of the puzzle, the final nail in the coffin that would leave him completely broken. Chapter 6. The Final Twist. I watched him closely, waiting for the right moment to deliver the final blow. He was still staring at the papers, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of it all. The friends around the fire pit had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, not knowing what to say, what to do. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, and it was time. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Oh, and one more thing," I said, my tone casual, almost dismissive, as if this was just an afterthought. "I've been seeing someone else." He froze. His head snapped up, eyes locking onto mine. A mix of confusion and horror etched across his face. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I smiled, a cold, calculated smile, the one I had been holding back for months, waiting for the perfect moment to let him see who I had become. "You remember Jake, don't you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, my voice dripping with satisfaction. "Your friend from work?" For a moment, I thought he might pass out. His eyes widened, and for the first time that night, I saw real fear in them. Jake had been his closest confidant, the one person he trusted with everything. They'd worked together for years, laughed together, shared drinks, secrets, plans. Jake had been his go-to for everything. And now, Jake was mine. You're lying," he stammered, his voice cracking. But the look on his face told me he already knew the truth. He just didn't want to believe it. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, enjoying the look of complete devastation on his face. "I've been seeing him for months," I said simply. "While you were out with her, I was with him." His world was crumbling, and I could see it in the way his face twisted with pain, his breathing shallow, his hands clenching the papers in his lap. He had lost everything in the span of a few minutes. The house, the money, his pride. And now, his best friend. I had played him perfectly. Narration. It wasn't enough to leave him with nothing. I needed him to feel what it was like to lose everything. He sat there, staring at me, broken. And I let him. I let him feel every ounce of the betrayal he had inflicted on me. I let him drown in it, just like I had. For months, I had lived in the shadow of his lies, suffocated by the weight of his deceit. Now, he was the one suffocating, and it felt good. For the rest of the night, no one said a word. Our friends sat in stunned silence, not daring to look at him, not daring to look at me. The fire burned low, the flames crackling softly, and I watched him as he stared into the dying embers, the papers still clutched in his trembling hands. There was nothing left for him. I had taken it all. Chapter 7. The Consequences. As I walked away from the fire pit, the cool night air biting at my skin, I felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over me. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, not like this. Freedom. It clung to me like the smoke rising from the dying flames behind me, curling into the sky. My heart, which had been a cage of bitterness and rage for months, finally felt like it had cracked open. The chains that had held me bound to this man, to the life we once shared, were broken. But I didn't dare smile, not yet. I knew better. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The scene I left behind at the fire pit would be burned into my memory forever. The stunned faces of our friends, their mouths slightly open in disbelief, too shocked to say anything. They didn't know what to do, didn't know if they should comfort him or condemn him. Most of all, it was his face, his utterly broken expression, that stuck with me. He had looked at me with a mixture of devastation and betrayal that was so deep, it had momentarily frozen him in place. It was exactly what I had wanted. But as satisfying as it was in the moment, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. No one walks away from something like this unscathed. There would be consequences, for both of us. The night was quiet as I continued walking, the sound of the fire pit fading behind me. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path leading back to the house, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint hum of the lake in the distance. Each step felt heavy, like I was walking toward an unknown future that had no clear shape yet. I had won the battle, but there was still a war to face. Inside, I could feel the storm brewing, not just in him, but in me too. There was a weight that hung in the air, pressing down on my chest with every breath. Freedom didn't come without a cost, and I had already started paying it. Narration. In that moment, I finally felt free, but freedom comes with a price. And I wasn't the only one who would pay. I made my way back to the house, the soft glow of the porch lights ahead. No more tears. It was over. As the night wore on, I felt the weight of what I had done settling into my bones. I had taken everything from him, his life, his pride, his future. But what had I taken from myself in the process? What had I lost in my quest for revenge? The camera fades to black as I walk into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of what was once my life. The sound of the fire crackling lingers, echoing in the background as the screen goes silent. Voiceover. But what happens next, you'll never see coming. The end was just the beginning, guiding my steps. The night was darker now, the stars obscured by a blanket of clouds that had rolled in while we were all gathered around the fire. It felt symbolic, in a way, like the calm before the storm had passed, and now, the real chaos was about to begin. Inside, the house was empty, quiet. Our friends would stay by the fire pit for a while longer, probably whispering amongst themselves, processing what had just happened. They wouldn't come to me. Not yet. They were too shocked, too unsure of what to say. And besides, I didn't need their sympathy. This was my victory, and I intended to savor it alone, at least for now. I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was starting to fade. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over in my head. His face, the papers in his hands, the moment he realized it was all over. It was exactly what I had planned, exactly what I had envisioned. But now that it was done, something else lingered, an unease I couldn't shake. I had spent so long focused on my revenge, on taking everything from him, that I hadn't thought much about what came next. Now that I had burned everything down, I wasn't sure what to do with the ashes. I leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes for a moment. There was a part of me that wanted to feel triumphant, that wanted to bask in the satisfaction of having outplayed him, of having won. But instead, I felt hollow, empty, as if the cost of this freedom had drained me of something I couldn't get back. The sound of footsteps on the gravel outside snapped me out of my thoughts. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. His voice, low and trembling, called out from behind me, near the fire pit. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was him. Narration. His voice called out one last time, but I didn't stop. I stood, moving to the window and pulling the curtain back just enough to see him. He was standing by the fire pit, still holding the divorce papers in his hand, his head lowered. He looked so small, so defeated. I could hear the distant murmur of our friends around him, their voices hushed, unsure of what to say. He called my name again, louder this time, but I didn't answer. I watched him from the safety of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. He was broken now, just as I had planned, but something about the way he stood there, surrounded by people yet utterly alone, made my chest tighten with something close to pity. I had done this. I had reduced him to this hollow shell of a man, but I couldn't let myself feel guilty. He had deserved this, every last piece of it. Narration. There's no turning back now. I turned away from the window, letting the curtain fall back into place. I knew this wasn't the end. He wouldn't let it be the end. No one accepts defeat like that without a fight. There would be phone calls, lawyers, confrontations. He would try to take back what I had taken from him, try to salvage what little remained of his life. But it wouldn't work. I had been too careful, too thorough. Every move I had made was calculated, and there was nothing he could do to change the outcome now. I had one, and he was just going to have to live with that. Still, a sense of unease settled over me like a shadow. It wasn't just him I had to worry about. There were other pieces of the puzzle I hadn't yet accounted for. Other people who would be hurt by what I had done. The kids, the friends who had witnessed this. The life I was now going to have to build from scratch. The price of freedom was steep, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to pay it in full. Epilogue. The cliffhanger. The hours ticked by slowly, the house quiet around me. I sat on the couch, staring into the darkness, the sound of the fire pit crackling in the distance. Every now and then, I could hear the faint murmur of voices from outside, but I didn't move. I didn't go back. His voice had called out for me one last time, but I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. No more lies, no more confessions.